Right now, the entire world is watching the wrong thing. The headlines are celebrating a ceasefire. The media calls it a triumph of diplomacy. Washington is breathing a massive sigh of relief. But as someone who analyzes the hidden architecture of global power, I must tell you the cold truth. This is not peace. It is an ambush. You are watching the American empire walk blindly into a meticulously engineered trap. The question everyone is asking is, did American deterrence finally work? That is the wrong question. The deeper question, the one that should terrify every Western economic planner is, who actually benefits when the fighting stops, but the structural threat becomes permanent? What looks like progress is actually a systemic failure. This is a hidden mechanism I call the asymmetric attrition trap. Iran has not backed down. They have simply shifted the war from missiles to mathematics. By agreeing to this pause, the United States has not secured the region. They have effectively agreed to bleed themselves dry, freezing their military bandwidth indefinitely. I am Professor Jiang Xueqin, and today I will reveal the hidden system beneath this celebrated ceasefire and exactly why you will pay the heavy price. Turn on any major news network right now, and you will hear the exact same comforting lie. The mainstream narrative says America flexed its military muscle, and Iran finally blinked. Politicians in Washington are taking victory laps. They claim that deploying massive carrier strike groups forced Tehran to the negotiating table, successfully preventing a regional war. But here is the fatal flaw in that logic. Washington is measuring victory like it is still 1991. The truth is, they are obsessed with immediate optics, with avoiding bad headlines before the next election cycle. But geopolitical reality does not care about American political calendars. Iran did not blink. Tehran simply looked at the global chessboard and realized they no longer need to fire a single missile to paralyze the United States. By accepting the terms of this ceasefire, the West believes it has extinguished a fire. In reality, they have stepped into a pool of strategic quicksand. They are celebrating a temporary tactical pause while completely ignoring the structural war they are losing. And to understand why this miscalculation is so dangerous, you have to understand the specific invisible weapon Iran is using against them right now. A hidden weapon that changes absolutely everything. Let me explain the framework. I call it the asymmetric attrition trap. In traditional warfare, you defeat an enemy by destroying their military. But in asymmetric game theory, you defeat a superpower by forcing them to deploy expensive assets against your cheapest threats. And here is the brilliant, terrifying part. You do not even need an active war to achieve this. You just need the constant threat of one. When Iran agreed to this celebrated ceasefire, they did not dismantle their proxy networks. They did not surrender their ballistic missile stockpiles. They simply paused the kinetic strikes. Why? Because a hot war gives the United States immediate justification to strike back and destroy Iranian infrastructure. But a ceasefire? A ceasefire acts as an invisible diplomatic shield. Under the illusion of peace, Iran maintains a loaded gun pointed directly at the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, and American bases across the Middle East. This forces Washington into an impossible game. The U.S. cannot withdraw its aircraft carriers, destroyers, and air defense systems because the structural threat remains entirely intact. They are paralyzed. They must keep multi-billion-dollar armadas floating in the ocean indefinitely, burning millions in fuel and maintenance every single day, just to maintain a fragile status quo. This is not peace. This is the active weaponization of time. Iran is using the ceasefire agreement to lock American forces into a permanent defensive crouch. They are bleeding the U.S. Treasury and exhausting the U.S. Navy without sacrificing a single Iranian soldier. The media calls this de-escalation, but in the cold logic of structural power, it is a masterclass in slow-motion geopolitical attrition. And when you look at the actual numbers, the brutal physical math of what this cost the United States, the true scale of the trap becomes undeniable. Let us calculate the brutal math of this paralysis. An American carrier strike group is the apex predator of the oceans. It costs billions to build, and millions more every single day just to keep the engines running and the crew fed. Right now, under the terms of this so-called ceasefire, Washington is forced to keep these massive floating cities permanently anchored in the Middle East. Why? Because the Iranian proxy network has not been dismantled. They are simply waiting. This creates a catastrophic asymmetry in cost. If the ceasefire breaks tomorrow, an Iranian-backed militia can launch a mass-produced explosive drone that costs perhaps $20,000. To shoot that cheap drone down and protect commercial shipping, an American destroyer must fire a high-tech interceptor missile. Do you know what that missile costs? Over $2 million. Every time the United States defends itself in this theater, it loses the economic exchange by a ratio of 100 to 1. And that is the structural trap. Iran does not need to sink an American aircraft carrier to win. They just need to keep it there. They need to keep American interceptor stockpiles depleting. They need to force the Pentagon to divert critical munitions away from the Pacific and away from Europe, pouring them into a defensive black hole. The ceasefire guarantees this paralysis. If the US leaves, the global maritime choke points close. If they stay, they bleed resources indefinitely against an enemy that builds weapons out of cheap commercial parts. Washington is currently trapped in a math equation it cannot solve. But this is not just an abstract military problem. The cost of this structural paralysis does not stay confined to the Pentagon's budget. It is about to hit you directly in a way you will feel every single month. And this is exactly where the geopolitical chess game directly enters your personal bank account. Most people believe that when a ceasefire is officially signed, the global economy stabilizes, supply chains unclog, prices finally go down. But under the asymmetric attrition trap, the exact opposite happens. Because the Iranian proxy threat was never actually neutralized, the massive risk to global shipping remains permanently elevated. The world's major freight companies are not stupid. They know this ceasefire is an absolute mirage. That is why they are still routing massive container ships the long way around Africa, avoiding the Red Sea choke points entirely. This adds weeks to transit times and burns millions of extra gallons of fuel per voyage. Who do you think pays for that? You do. It is baked into the cost of your groceries, your electronics, and your winter clothes. Freight rates explode. Insurance premiums skyrocket. This permanent structural friction guarantees creeping, inescapable inflation. But the deeper problem is energy. By maintaining a loaded gun pointed at the Strait of Hormuz, the vital artery of global oil, Iran has successfully engineered a permanent threat premium into the energy markets. Oil prices remain artificially high, and when energy costs stay high, inflation cannot be killed. This completely traps the Federal Reserve. They cannot lower interest rates while supply chain inflation is structurally baked in. That means your mortgage rates stay brutal. Your credit card debt crushes you faster. The hidden cost of this fake peace is quietly draining your wealth. You are funding this empire's paralysis every single time you swipe your card at the gas station or the supermarket. We have seen this exact geopolitical dynamic play out before in history. And to understand how this specific trap eventually crushes a superpower, we must look at a terrifying, undeniable historical echo. Let us step back for a moment and look at the brutal rhythm of history. Great empires rarely die from a single catastrophic invasion. They die from exhaustion. Look at the decline of the Roman Empire. When Rome could no longer decisively crush threats on its eastern frontier, it began signing treaties with the Parthian and Sassanid empires. The Romans celebrated these peripheral truces as diplomatic victories, but it was a mirage. The truces simply forced Rome to keep massive, expensive legions permanently stationed on the borders, draining the imperial treasury while their rivals grew stronger in the shadows. Rome was bled dry by the illusion of peace. Washington is repeating this exact historical suicide. They are bankrupting their military capacity to maintain a fake stability in the Middle East. They are paying the ultimate price for a pause in the fighting. But if you think Iran is executing this masterstroke in isolation, you are missing the most terrifying part of the equation. Tehran is not acting alone. They are merely one piece in a much larger systemic architecture designed to permanently fracture American power. And this is exactly where the global geopolitical board expands and the true trap closes. And this brings us to the most dangerous, unspoken reality. The asymmetric attrition trap is not a solo operation by Iran. It is a highly coordinated mechanism in a much larger system-level conflict. Let me be very clear. The ceasefire in the Middle East is perfectly timed to serve the broader strategic goals of Russia and China. This is the triple game. While the United States burns through multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles to protect commercial shipping routes from cheap drones, what is actually happening globally? The Pentagon's stockpile is being hollowed out. Munitions that are desperately needed to deter aggression in the Pacific or to stabilize the front line in Eastern Europe are being squandered in the Red Sea. Beijing and Moscow are watching this with absolute delight. Every American warship forced to remain indefinitely in the Persian Gulf is an American warship that is not patrolling the Taiwan Strait. Every $1 billion spent intercepting Iranian proxy rockets is $1 billion that cannot be used to counter Russian advances. Iran is acting as the perfect vanguard, bleeding American resources on the periphery while the core global challengers accelerate their own timelines. The ceasefire is not a U.S. diplomatic victory. It is a vital pressure release valve for the anti-Western axis. They have successfully lured the United States into a massive misallocation of strategic bandwidth. Washington is so desperate for short-term political wins that they are entirely blind to the long-term structural collapse this guarantees. And if this trend continues, the consequences will be immediate and severe. Based on the raw data of how this trap functions, here is exactly how this geopolitical disaster will unfold over the next 18 months. Now that you see the hidden architecture of this trap, what happens next? I am going to give you 3 hard, analytical predictions for the next 18 months. Watch these variables closely. Prediction number 1. The inflation pivot will fail completely. Mainstream economists are predicting rate cuts and a return to normal. They are wrong. Because the Red Sea and Hormuz choke points remain under structural threat, shipping and energy premiums will spike at the slightest provocation. The Federal Reserve will be trapped, forced to keep interest rates punishingly high, suffocating the middle class while the government prints more money to fund its paralyzed military. Prediction number 2. A sudden, manufactured crisis in the Pacific. Within the next year, watch for a severe escalation in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. Beijing knows exactly how many U.S. interceptor missiles are currently sitting at the bottom of the Red Sea. They know the Pentagon's logistical supply chain is stretched to the absolute breaking point. When China moves to test American resolve, Washington will face a devastating mathematical reality. They simply do not have the naval bandwidth to fight on 2 massive fronts simultaneously. Prediction number 3. The proxy swarm upgrade. Iran will use this diplomatic pause and the financial relief that inevitably follows to mass-produce next-generation AI-linked drone swarms. They are not scaling back, they are reloading. By the middle of next year, the cost asymmetry will shift from 100 to 1 to 1,000 to 1. America's multi-million-dollar defense shields will be mathematically rendered obsolete by sheer volume. The trap is set. The math is inescapable. But geopolitics is never just abstract lines on a map or numbers in a defense budget. At the end of this brutal equation, someone has to pay the ultimate price. And this is the final reality you must understand today. When empires miscalculate, it is never the politicians in Washington who pay the price. They will continue to celebrate their hollow diplomatic victories on television. But out here in the real world, the consequences of the asymmetric attrition trap are going to tear through your daily life. You are the one who will pay for this paralyzed empire every time you buy groceries, fill your gas tank, or try to pay down your mortgage in an era of permanent structural inflation. You are the one who will watch your purchasing power evaporate to fund a military machine bleeding out against cheap drones in the desert. And if the ultimate price is demanded, When this fragile fake peace shatters and the system-level conflict finally ignites across multiple oceans, it will not be the elites who are sent to fight a mathematically unwinnable war. It will be your sons and daughters. The ceasefire was never a victory. It was the exact moment the trap snapped shut. Do not let the comforting mainstream headlines blind you to the cold, structural reality. Share this critical warning with your friends and family. Prepare yourself today, because the board is set and the illusion of peace is over.